Hi friends, welcome to our course, Race and American Politics. Today, we will be discussing race and voting rights in the history of United States. Actually, after conceptually discussing what race is and how the concept of race has been redefined in American history, we discussed the changing boundaries of different racial groups in the United States. After these foundational, substantive conceptual topics, today we will be discussing the political connection between one's racial identity and their basic political rights within a democracy, that is voting rights. Okay, so as you all know, the history of voting rights for non-white groups, especially African Americans, is full of discrimination, unequal treatment, and suppression. After the founding of country, actually most of the African Americans were not even given the status of full citizens, and they were not allowed to vote because many of them, as you know, were just enslaved, and they are counted to be 3/5 of a white person, as well as they are counted as a property of a white plantation owner, right? Only some people who are called as free colored population by the census, who are living in American North, were able to turn out to vote. This situation or this topic has been a very controversial issue in 1890s, upon which the entire country were dragged into a civil war, which resulted with the passing away of 5% of the entire American population. When the Civil War was resulted with the victory of Lincoln's forces, actually, there have been three very important constitutional amendments enacted. These are 13 amendments, which eliminated slavery in code, except for the people who are punished for a crime, okay? 14 amendments introduced constitutional guaranteed citizenship right for African Americans, and 15 amendments constitutionally guaranteed the voting rights of African American men. Women were not allowed to vote at that time. So this era, which is called Reconstruction, actually has been the period of great upheaval in the incorporation of African Americans into the political community, in the sense that millions of new voters integrate into the system, resulting with great increase in the number of elected African American politicians. In federal level, as congressmen, there have been, as far as I remember, around 20, and hundreds of state legislatures, okay? However, the Reconstruction period didn't last long. As a result of the confluence of several factors, which I won't elaborate here, the Reconstruction period has ended in roughly late 1870s because of the retreat of federal powers, guaranteeing the perpetuation of these new constitutional amendment rules in the American South. Roughly in the late 19th century, actually all of the new entitlements, new rules, new rights of African Americans have been eliminated in the American South through a series of legal and extra-legal tools. Legal tools such as grandfather clauses, which simply mean that if you can vote only insofar as your grandfather could vote before 1867, right? As we all know, African Americans, especially in the South, where their grandfather clauses were adopted, they were slaves. So they weren't even citizens who can vote. Or some other strategies like poll taxes. So you were supposed to pay a certain amount of taxation, and there are certain rules administrating this process, which discourage African Americans, which kept them distant from the ballot boxes. Or there are some other rules, such as white primaries. So Democratic Party actually achieved monopoly in the American South. So they were the only viable party in the region. So they declared that, okay, we don't want any non-white people in our primary elections, like which means, or which is simply called as white primaries. And it was deemed, today it can seem very outrageous, very ridiculous, but this was taken or accepted as a legally justifiable proposal and rule in that period. If you can achieve, or there were some other, let's say, tools like literacy tests. So as we all know, again, as slaves, African Americans, they were unable to learn reading and writing. If some people, if a small number of African Americans who are slaves learned to write and read, they were actually severely and physically punished. Knowing that, these election administrators and like local politicians, they introduced literacy tests, knowing that, assuming that most of the African Americans won't be able to read. Why? Because they were not allowed to read or get this necessary education. So if an African American can transcend all of these legal barriers, there were some extra legal tactics, such as Ku Klux Klan, KKK. They organized, they beat it, they harassed, they lynched many African Americans who were trying to actually take advantage of their constitutionally guaranteed voting rights. Okay, so as a result of the combination of all these suppressive rules, the turnout rate of African Americans actually almost reached to zero in the region. Only maybe 1% or 2% of African American population could turn out to vote in American southern states. Okay, this period is called the Jim Crow period. Okay, when the African Americans were excluded from the political life in the American South, and they were provided like very undeveloped, very in advance, very inferior social provisions due to separate but equal doctrine. Okay. In this period, we are talking about the period between roughly 1890s until, let's say, 1950s. In the federal level, at least, there were not many political initiatives like coming from either party for the full inclusion or full equality of African Americans. For the Democrats, they were very adamant, very strong, attached to the like suppressive, racially hierarchical Jim Crow system in the South. Whereas Republican Party, which was actually much more sympathetic to the cause of African Americans for full equality, they were complicit in the enactment and perpetuation of such suppressive rules. However, this situation has, although gradually, changed until 1950s and 1960s. There are many explanations to explain, to account for, to clarify the historical process of changing attitudes within both Democratic and Republican Party. Okay, so some of these historical phenomena are: first, Great Migration. Millions of African Americans in the American South, they migrated to the American North to be a part of recently burgeoning industrial economy in the North, especially after the First World War. Okay, so this meant that the electorate population of African Americans in the American North got bigger in 1920s and 1930s, which turned them into much more efficacious, much more viable constituency group for the politicians running for office in the northern states, which is an important issue. Also, before Nazis came into power, or before the actual onset of the Second World War, actually the Jim Crow practices, Jim Crow laws, they were like inspiring elements and precedents for Nazi politicians and Nazi criminal authorities to introduce, to institutionalize, to establish Nuremberg laws and other legal codes regulating the political body in their country. Okay, so Nazi rules, Nazi laws were inspired by the practices and laws in the American South. However, after the start of Second World War, actually it has been politically costly for a like semi-democratic or racially exclusive or white democratic political country to sustain their affiliation with racial ideology, because due to the geopolitical calculations of the Second World War, the United States framed itself as a defender of the free world, okay, as a defender of democracy. So, which was an important ideological impulse or reason or incentive to reconsider the effectiveness or the legitimacy or justification of earlier practices of suppression of African American votes. Okay. After the end of Second World War, the United States found itself in a Cold War against the USSR, okay, which meant that both superpowers, they competed with one another to win the hearts and minds of the people of color in the global South, which make it again even much more costly for a regime to sustain racial suppression, racial discrimination at home, while claiming to be the leader of the free world, or while trying to win the appreciation and political support of people of color in other parts of the world. This was another incentive. And we shouldn't forget the great organizing of NAACP first and civil rights movements later on. So African Americans, actually with the help of some white societal groups, they were able to organize a very effective, like bottom-up social organizing, disrupting like legal, political, and economic institutions, rules, and practices leading to the exclusion of minority groups, especially African Americans, from the political, economic, and social life, which resulted, which perpetuated, which paved the way for the enactment of 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act. Okay, so Voting Rights Act is especially important because it again introduced some legal measures to re-guarantee the constitutional voting rights of African Americans. Okay, the states with the history of suppression of African American votes, they actually had to get the consent of federal attorney and some other federal bureaus to enact, to introduce any other rule to administrate electoral processes or elections. So, which made it very hard, very unlikely for a former Jim Crow state, okay, to pass another law like white primaries, like literacy tests, poll taxation, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So 1965 Voting Rights Act, friends, meant the enfranchisement of millions of African Americans, and it can even be seen as the time period, as the year, as the turning point for the United States to become a democracy. Almost for the first time in history, okay? To become a relatively full democracy. Post-1965 period, actually, we witnessed the growing power of African Americans as voters and as politicians as well, because they were actually had fewer difficulties to be elected as politicians. So the descriptive representation of African Americans increased in the country, meaning that there were many more elected African American Congress people, state legislatures, judges, blah, blah, blah. After 1965, actually, like felt betrayed from the Democratic Party because like first Kennedy, later on Lyndon Johnson, kind of they became important political actors for the enactment of Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. The Southern whites, actually, they gradually deserted the party. They gradually stopped supporting the Democratic Party. So the Republican Party actually filled the vacuum for these groups, okay? This process has been very gradually. Started in 1965 and maybe it was almost over until 1980s. So Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, both Republican presidents, actually, they started like the Southern opening strategies. So it was federally very hard to undermine, okay, the Voting Rights Act or to deprive African Americans from their voting rights, but they adopted at least two important strategies which had long-term influences, repercussions over the voting rights of African Americans. First, by adopting the discourse of law and order, especially Richard Nixon, like greatly increased the suppressive or power of American criminal justice system and the police forces. And this enhanced, this augmented capacity was differentially used against racial minority groups. So as we all know, the campaign of war against drugs has been racially manipulated and has been racially actually inspired. So certain drugs, certain pods like marijuana and some other stuff, which was used mostly by African Americans, were declared illegal, which put many African American men behind the fences in the jails. So the number of prisoners, inmates, rose from 300,000 to 2 million. So multiplied by several folds. It had been two results, okay? The first one, in many states, there are felon disenfranchisement rules, which meant that once a person is convicted of a crime, once they have been a prisoner, they are, for the rest of their life, unable to vote, which meant that millions of African Americans couldn't achieve to vote. Like some estimates say that it's even 2 million people couldn't vote in the elections because of that. Another mechanism, actually, as Weaver and Lerman pointed out, the exposure, okay, the encounter with the criminal justice system, which racial minority groups, especially African Americans and Latinos, were more likely to encounter, more likely to be exposed to criminal justice authority, Actually, it had a demobilizing effect on them. So they became less trusting of government. Okay. They became less trusting of the political processes, which made them less likely to participate in politics, less likely to participate in civil engagement. Okay. So it has another, although indirect, effect on the suppression of like minority votes and participation in elections. Another actually tool was the nomination of Supreme Court judges by the Republican Party elites who think that these judges will like in a piecemeal way undermine voting rights acts and the entitlements coming with them. Okay. This strategy actually has turned out to be successful. We understood it in 2013, which shall be counted this decision, when the Supreme Court said that the southern states were no longer required to get the consent of federal authorities to regulate these election laws. Pay attention to the period, 2013. It is post-2008 period, which meaning that it is post-Obama period, or it is the period after the Obama's first election into the White House, okay? As we all know, Barack Obama has been the first president with a minority background, or with a non-white background, let's say, okay? So his election became possible as a result of the mobilization of 15 million new voters. Most of them were non-white minority groups like Asians, Hispanics, Blacks. And needless to say, the great majority of these people voted for Obama, sending him to the White House. This has been very striking for many groups in the American life. Okay, so like many organizations, many NGOs, many political party leaders, many branches of like Republican Party, they started to devise new strategies to actually change the current trend in American politics, because the number of minority descent people is increasing vis-a-vis the white groups in the society. And at least with today's political alignments, most of the minority groups were voting for the Democratic Party, which is a detrimental situation for the Republican Party in the future. Okay, so by also taking advantage of 2013 shall be counted decision, actually many former Jim Crow states, they started to introduce new legal codes, okay, as Carol Anderson greatly elaborated, discussed in her like chapter, which I assigned for this week. As she pointed out, many rules of voter identification were actually introduced with the excuse of protecting the electoral integrity of voting or of the country. Actually, there have been several important studies actually analyzing, examining whether there is any issue in the electoral integrity of the United States. And friends, only, be careful about this number, only 32 votes have been found like misspecified or have been found erroneous among hundreds of millions of votes in last a few elections. So there is no serious issue of votes integrity in the United States. But by adopting this course, by taking advantage of, let's say, this rhetorical tendency, okay, many states, they started to introduce new rules for someone to prove their identification as a voter, okay? These rules were actually framed, developed, devised, actually manufactured in a certain way by requiring only certain documentation, by requiring only certain deadlines, by requiring actually long travels, or by to, let's say, DMVs or some other institutions to get these documentations. So there were some very nuanced instruments which make these new rules much more disadvantageous for minority groups, okay? Mostly for African Americans and Latinos. So these so-called voter suppression rules actually became effective, demobilize African American voters and Latino voters or non-white voters in 2016 elections. Okay, millions of people were actually discouraged from, were demobilized from participating in elections. Okay, so we are seeing again a certain level of rules like creeping, undermining the political equality of minority groups. So in the history of the United States, there have been some periods of inclusion of minority groups, such as post-Civil War or Reconstruction period, or let's say post-Voting Rights Act period. However, in many of these decades, or almost all of these decades, these periods, we have seen some other attempts to undo the recently granted and provision and benefits and legal rights of African Americans by Democrats after post-Civil War period and Republicans today. Okay, so this is kind of the brief history of voting rights for non-white minority groups in the United States. So I hope this has been a helpful, clarifying brief lecture. Again, please take it as an auxiliary, as a helpful resource, but focus more on the readings that you are assigned for this week. Thanks so much for listening and hope to see you again, virtually at least, in the other video lecture to come. Take care.